It sounds needless to repeat it maybe, but the goal of terrorism is terror. In other words, fear. And one of the things that fear is relied upon to do is to somehow paralyze reason or rationality, cognition, and things like this, so that you believe things, you put into a kind of infantile state where you're willing to believe things that otherwise you would not believe. And you have to also remember, I guess as people can, that this was a tremendous shock. It was a mental trauma from which it was hard to recover for quite a number of months or weeks. And I hope now that the years have gone by, people are able to come out of this, to snap out of it. I certainly hope so, and that's one of the goals of the 9/11 Truth Movement, which I think is growing. The issue is more relevant than ever. The issue won't go away, 9/11 won't go away as long as we're living under this invisible government regime that fixes elections, starts revolutions in foreign countries, and above all prepares new wars.
One other thing. You have a section here called Islamic Fundamentalism, Fostered by U.S. Foreign Policy.
Well, what I try to show here is that if you look at the history of the Arab states and the Islamic states, but in particular the Arab states, the ones that were part of the Turkish or Ottoman Empire, those were places that were in a kind of suspended political and economic development, I'm afraid, under the Ottoman Empire. In some cases, it was Napoleon's invasion of Egypt that got things going in some of these places in terms of ferment or modernization. But by the time of the 20th century, these places had begun to produce nationalists who were reformers, who were modernizers. And it's useful to remember a figure like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in Turkey. I think he's pretty much the model for them, at least in the 20th century, though you can find similar things in Egypt going back even further. Ataturk is somebody who comes in with a modernization program. He lifts the Islamic law, the Sharia. He outlaws the veil, the harem, the fez, demands the Roman alphabet, comes in with 5-year plans of economic development. It's interesting that Turkey is the only loser in World War I that does not go fascist in the 1920s or 30s. Most of the other, practically all of the other losers did go fascist, but Turkey did not. So this is, I think, a person of very significant historical significance. You can look at some of these other countries. Think of Nasser in Egypt, nationalizing the Suez Canal, wanting to use the money for the Aswan High Dam, for the economic and agricultural development of Egypt, industrialization, Arab socialism, pan-Arabism. You have to say these are mixed figures. There's a lot of demagogy. There's a lot of rhetorical excess. How did the West treat somebody like Ataturk or somebody like Nasser? Did they welcome the presence of a modernizing secular nationalist who was not based on Islam in any sense, not against it necessarily, or not against it, not determined to wipe it out? But what did the West do? These figures were opposed. The West did everything to destroy them, to humiliate them, to attack them, to isolate them, to remove them from the picture. And what I do in that chapter is I go through Iraq. Who was a positive figure in the history of Iraq? You don't like Saddam Hussein? That's fine. Who was positive? General Qassem in the 1950s was somebody who brought in a very interesting Republican constitution, tried to get economic development going. What happened to him? Foreign support for a coup. He's murdered. Saddam Hussein is one of his opponents. That's sort of the pedigree of Saddam Hussein. You look at Ali Bhutto in Pakistan. He wants to develop Pakistan, including with nuclear energy. What happens to him? Kissinger arranges for Zia-ul-Haq to come in and have a coup, and Ali Bhutto is actually hanged. You go through the rest of these countries. I try to do Afghanistan. I try to do as many as I can to show that the Western powers did everything they could to destroy real nationalists who were modernizers and secularists. And that, in a sense, they've also done everything possible to bring forward what I would have to consider to be relatively benighted or backward versions of the prevalent religion in these countries. In other words, people who were hostile to technology and science, who wanted women in a degraded position, who didn't like education, who were social reactionaries in just about every way, and also who were incapable of making alliances with Europe or other powers in the world that might have helped these countries to get somewhere. So what you have is self-isolating figures, in a way, that are promoted. Maybe the case of the Shah of Iran is also relevant. Here the positive figure was Mossadegh, right, in the early 1950s. So here's a secular reformer, secular nationalist, and of course what does he do? He's got to nationalize the oil companies, and at that point the British and the U.S., Kermit Roosevelt, do everything they can to destroy him. Then you get the Shah. The Shah, of course, in many ways is a monster, and he's incapable of developing a political alternative, but he does have a very ambitious economic development program, and he's pushing this through, and at a certain point, Zbigniew Brzezinski decides that Islamic fundamentalism is the bulwark against the Soviets in the Middle East and the Gulf, and according to my findings, Brzezinski essentially masterminds the overthrow of the Shah, and then demands that Khomeini be brought in as the leader of Iran. Now, the world has turned over a couple of times since then, but that's the origin of the current regime. I'm not trying to use that to argue for an attack on Iran, anything but. But that's ultimately how things got to be the way they are, this process of constant meddling. Brzezinski is maybe the clearest case. He says, Islamic fundamentalism is the bulwark against the Soviets. We will support it. So there I think you have it in a nutshell. It's that the current situation in these countries is the product of having deliberately and systematically destroyed the many positive alternatives that were there on the way.